It, recording was to be started later. We have a very young and a dynamic speaker today on a very different topic, which is an overview of MLI. Now, without wasting much time, I will ask CA Aman Khandelwal to start with the Institute motto, please.
य एष सुप्तेषु जाग्रति य एष सुप्तेषु जाग्रति कामं 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 कामपुरुषो पुरुषो निर्विमाणः तदेव शुक्रं तदेव शुक्रब्रह्मा तद्ब्रह्मा तदेवामृतमुच्यते तस्मिन् लोकः शतः सर्वे तदूनात्यपि कश्चन एतद्द्वैता 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 एतद्द्वैता.
Thank you, Aman. Once again, a very warm welcome to all the members. Without wasting much time, I would request CA Bijal Doshi to introduce our today's speaker.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Mahesh Nayak is a chartered accountant having more than 8 years of experience in field of international taxation, business restructuring, domestic tax, transfer pricing, and FEMA. He is currently a senior manager in direct tax and consulting practice of CNK and Associates LLP in Mumbai. He has prior experience as a manager in direct tax practice of ENY LLP. He has successfully completed the advanced LLM in international tax from International Tax Center, Netherlands. He is also a member of Managing Committee and convener of International Taxation Committee of Bombay Chartered Accountants Society. He is a regular speaker and has led group discussion on international tax as well as domestic tax issues in various conferences and study circles organized by various professional associations. He also co-authored chapters in MLI Compendium of BCAS and International Taxation Compendium of CTC. With this brief introduction, I would like to welcome you to BCIC and I would like to present the momentum. Thank you, sir. You can start with the session.
Just one small thing. We would, because you're a chartered accountant, our BCSC contributes rupees 500 as a token towards the memorial fund on your behalf, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Benevolent Fund.
Thank you. Good evening, friends. Firstly, I would like to thank the Borivali CP Study Circle for inviting me and for giving me an opportunity to address the members. Just a minute, let me just share my screen. Is the screen visible?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Yes. So friends, today we'll be covering the part of the MLI. So we'll be giving a brief overview of the MLI. I understand that next week you would also be having a topic on section 195, where the speaker would also be covering, you know, what one needs to look at when one is say issuing form 15CB. Especially in light of the changes in the domestic tax law as well as the tax treaties in MLI, etc. Let's look at what we would be trying to cover today. We will be covering what is the BEPS, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project of the OECD, a brief overview of what is the BEPS project, what was the need for the BEPS project, then what is the MLI, how does the MLI function, and then we will be briefly covering some of the important articles of the MLI. MLI is a multilateral instrument, is a very vast subject where even possibly a month-long study course may not be sufficient to cover all the aspects. There are various nuances to the MLI because of the way that it interacts with the tax treaties. There are various complexities involved. Definitely, it is not something one can cover in 2 hours. What I intend to do is sort of give a brief flavor of the MLI, how it works, what are the key structures that so the first half we'll try and cover how the MLI works, and then what are the changes in the MLI, how it is changing, what was the what was the law before, and how it is changing in a particular fact pattern because of the MLI. So we'll be briefly covering that as well. So what is the base erosion profit shifting project? What was required? So as we know, in 2008 we had a global economic meltdown. Therefore, there definitely countries needed tax revenue. If you go back to, if you look at the tax treaties or you look at the OECD model, the first model was 1963. Before that, you had the League of Nations model of starting from 1928. If you read the model and you see today's model, except for a few changes, obviously there will be some changes, but apart from a few changes, broadly the structure has remained the same of tax treaties. While under domestic tax law, etc., there is an evolution under domestic tax law to be in touch with the pace at which business is changing. However, tax treaties have not been able to be amended accordingly because of the fact of the way the treaties work, because it requires negotiation, etc., between countries. So there has been an outdated tax system for tax treaties, and therefore there was a need to amend these tax treaties or the way they function. And in the last decade or so, earlier everyone was talking about tax evasion, but after this meltdown, there were various structures, and we look at some of these structures which the MNCs have been using in the past, which were used, which sort of were not just there was no tax evasion, but there was aggressive tax planning, and there was aggressive tax avoidance, which resulted in almost no tax that was paid in any of the countries. So on that note, the OECD formulated an action plan for base erosion and profit shifting, which was presented to the G20 members. The purpose of the action plan was to prevent double non-taxation as well as cases of no or low taxation associated with practices that artificially segregate taxable income from activities that generated. The idea was that the value or the income should be generated in countries where there is actual activities that are carried out, and one cannot reduce the income there artificially by using various structures. On that note, then they had 15 action points that were identified by the OECD and the G20, and a final report. So there, they started working on the action points, and for each action point, they had the draft reports that were released for public discussion. Public comments were invited. On the basis of public comments, the final reports were issued in October 2015. Let's look, before we get into MLI, let's look at some of these broad structures which were used by the MNCs. Briefly, we'll be covering them. Obviously, there are many more, and there are many other variations to these structures as well. This one is, which was typically used by Apple. So in the US, coming back before, for India, as we know, under Section 6, a company is a resident if it is incorporated in India or if its place of effective management is in India. However, most countries follow this sort of similar rule, where it may not have a poem, but it has a place of management in that country or incorporation in that country, then company will be considered as a resident. However, certain countries have deviated from that practice. For example, the US, under the US tax law, a company is a resident only if it is incorporated in the US. Similarly, Ireland had a rule that a company was considered as a resident of Ireland only if its place of management was in Ireland, not otherwise. So typically then what would happen is, people would set up companies which were incorporated in Ireland, having their place of management in the US. So this would result in the company not being a tax resident in either of the countries. Now let's look at how would that make a difference. So let's assume that in this case, B Limited is an operating company in the Netherlands, and Netherlands does not tax royalties paid to a non-resident. So when B Limited is an operating company, it earns this profit, it pays this royalty to A Limited. because B Limited does not, Netherlands does not tax the royalty, so this royalty income is say not taxed in Netherlands. Now, it is not taxed in the US because A Limited is not a resident of US. It is not taxed in Ireland because A Limited is not a resident of Ireland either. So it would result in a deduction in one country, but no taxation at all in the other countries. Similarly, you have this double Irish Dutch sandwich. So let's look at this, where a US company, through a cost sharing arrangement, has an intangible, creates an intangible in an Irish company. Now this IRCO in turn licenses the intangible to Netherlands. Netherlands company doesn't have anything except that it is just sub-licensing this intangible that it has received from Ireland to another Irish company, IRCO2, which is the operating company. Now, the first Ireland company, which is IRCO, has its place of management in a tax haven, say Bermuda. So what happens? IRCO2 obviously undertakes its operations, etc. Now, IRCO2 pays royalty to Netherlands. Now, because of the Netherlands Ireland tax treaty, and because they are part of the EU, this royalty paid is not taxed in Ireland. Netherlands company receives the royalty and it on pays the royalty to IRCO, leaving a small margin. So Netherlands NLCO will be taxed at a on the basis of the minor margin. So Netherlands company is taxed, but because it has received royalty and paid royalty only in respect of the margin, it will be taxed on its profits. Now Netherlands does not tax this royalty again payment to IRCO, and but the royalty received by IRCO is not taxed in Ireland, because while it is deductible in Netherlands, it is not taxable in Ireland because Netherlands IRCO is a tax resident of a tax haven. This is a structure. Then you also have, we will not get into this as well. This is the CVBV structure, which was typically used by Starbucks and various other MNCs. Just briefly, I'll tell you what the CVBV structure is. It makes use of these hybrid entities. So hybrid entities means entities which are opaque or opaque in one particular country, but transparent in the other country. So therefore, one would use these CVBV structures, or even in Luxembourg, you had the SICAV structure, etc., where one could use those sort of structures which are hybrid entities to ensure that you get a deduction or you remove profits from the operating company, getting a deduction there, but not being taxed anywhere else, or being taxed at a very minimal rate. And obviously, the point was, ideally, the US, in the US, you have the CFC regulations, which should be catching all this income. However, in the US also, there is something called as a check the box regime. So because of the check the box regime, it would sort of be a flow through process, and it may not have been taxed. So, so there were a lot of these structures that were being used by these MNCs. So on this basis, there were 15, like we said, there were 15 action points that were identified. So you had action point 1, which is in respect of the taxation of the digital economy, where we still see a discussion going on today, and where we had an agreement in July, the 1st of July, where how does one tax the digital economy, or the digitalized economy today? How does one tax that? And the countries have sort of reached a consensus on an approach, on a 2-pillar solution. That is, one expects that by end of the next month, one would have a sort of a draft agreement, and which should probably be signed by 2022 or 2023. Now, that was action point 1. Action point 2 talks about neutralizing the effects of hybrid mismatch arrangement. So we saw in the previous example, where in the CVBV structure, how hybrid entities can be used to achieve the objective of a deduction in one country, but no taxation in any other country. With not just hybrid entities, one can also use hybrid financial instruments. So you have hybrid financial instruments where it is treated as an interest in one country, but as a dividend in the other country, and where the dividend is not taxable in the other country, for example. So you have a particular hybrid payment, which is a typical payment which is treated as a debt, the payment towards debt in one country and towards equity in the other. Then you have action point 3, which talks about strengthening the CFC rules. Then we had action point 4, which talks about limiting the base erosion via interest reductions. So to ensure that there is, the companies do not have a too higher debt, so sort of a thin capitalization sort of a rule, and with which we do have section 94B, which has followed, which has been sort of formulated or enacted after using this action point 4 as a base. Action point 5 talks about countering harmful tax practices, taking into account transparency and substance. So basically, you have, in a lot of these European jurisdictions, you had these patent box regimes where, royalty income, etc., was not taxed. But, the patent box regime, well, even in India, we have the patent box regime, but the difference in those patent box regimes was that in India, you need to actually have carried on those activities to get the benefit of the patent box regime, to in the formation of the intangible. Whereas in those sort of jurisdictions, there was no real substance that was required, and one could just transfer an intangible for almost negligible value and get the benefit of the patent box regime there. So these are, so there is peer review, etc., by countries on these harmful tax practices, and sort of action that needs to be taken by the countries who have these sort of harmful tax practices to, and not just patent box regime. You have, your Luxembourg, etc., also have these finance or cash box regimes as well, as they call it. Then, in respect of substance, so you have action point 6. Action point 6, which talks about prevention of treaty abuse. So you have various points under treaty abuse. You have your principal purpose test, and we'll come to that. When we look at the significant MLI impact on that. But you have your principal purpose test, simplified LOB clause, change in the preamble, etc. And as well as how transfer of dividend cases or transfer of immovable property cases, etc. How does it what is the action that can be taken to counter these sort of treaty abuse that was taking place? Then action point 7 was how does one prevent the artificial avoidance of a PE status? So what are the different structures that are used, and we will come to that as well, because that is also enacted through the MLI. Action points 8, 9, 10, 10 refer to transfer pricing adjustments for various things, like such as intangibles, risks, capital, or other high risk transactions. Action point 11 talks about methodology to collect and analyze the BEPS to see what is happening. Action point 12 talks about disclosure of aggressive tax planning by various countries and by jurisdictions. Action point 13, you have the CBCR. 14 talks about the dispute resolution mechanism, which is also enacted by the to make MAP more sort of effective, which is also enacted in the MLI. And action point 15 is developing the multilateral instrument. So these are just the broad buckets. So if you see, we talked about action points 2, 3, and 4, which talks about your hybrid mismatch arrangement, CFC, and interest deductibility. These are where changes are required in the domestic tax law. So where changes are required in domestic tax law, there's a recommendation given by these action plans saying that this is the rule that you can enact, and or these are the rules that you can change in your existing rules if you already have them, to make it more sort of to strengthen those rules that you have. So this is just a recommendation for countries to enact or change the domestic tax law. Action points 6, 7, 14, and 15 refer to changes in the tax treaties, where one needs to amend the tax treaties, and where the MLA comes in, and we'll come to that. Action point 8, 9, 10, as well as action 13 in respect of CBCR refer to transfer pricing outcomes. 5, 11, and 12 is more of reporting and interaction between the tax officers. So then we come to the MLI. What is the multilateral instrument? So today we have more than 3,000 bilateral treaties between various countries. Now, as we saw earlier, there are 3 or 4 action points which require change in the tax treaties or modification of the tax treaties. Now, if one goes to modify a bilateral tax treaty, there will be a negotiation between the two states, between the two contracting states, and that would take a significant amount of time. Now, for example, it can take years, because if one country goes, say country A goes and says, okay, I want to negotiate and I want to amend this article in the tax treaty, the treaty partner will come and say, okay, you want to modify this, I want to modify this. then there'll be a negotiation, and and more so, and etc. So there'll be a back and forth and a lot of other things. So it can take a long time, and that may not be sufficient, because then we will reach a stage where again the business model has changed and there may be a need for a new MLI or a new BEPS action project, and therefore it is not really serving the purpose of if one goes the bilateral treaty way of one needs to go and negotiate. Again, it may not always reach the desired result. So the idea was to have a multilateral treaty which modifies all the tax treaties which are there, provided so if the country signs it, all its tax treaties stand amended. That is the objective. So you have your action point 15, which talked about how the multilateral instrument, etc., is to be implemented, and on that basis, we had approximately 100 jurisdictions participated in the development of the multilateral instrument. The text of which was released in November 2016. It was open for signing in 2017 when India also signed the MLI. As of August 2021, we have 95 countries which have signed the MLI. 4 countries have expressed their intent to sign the MLI. Most of the major countries in the world, so you have Singapore, Mauritius, UK, UAE, Netherlands, Germany, Japan, South Africa, are signatories to the MLI. The US participated in the BEPS project, but it is not a signatory to the MLI, so it's a notable absentee to the MLI. Of course, the US has participated in BEPS Action 1 very significantly in your Pillar 1, Pillar 2 proposal. So it is taking a sort of a discussion lead now, but it is not a signatory to the MLI where the treaties are amended. Similarly, Brazil is also not a signatory to the MLI. How does the MLI function? So one of the biggest successes is that without undergoing a bilateral treaty negotiation or ratification, if you are a signatory to the MLI, the treaties can be amended or modified. Now, how does it function? It basically modifies tax treaties. It does not amend them. So it basically sits next to a tax treaty, and the tax treaty continues functioning, and the MLI sits along with it. One needs to see, to the extent that incompatibility, the MLI overrides that aspect, and it modifies the text of the original tax treaty. Now there is something called as a synthesized text, which can be prepared by the countries, and you do have, if you go on the income tax side, you do see that there are synthesized texts. There are some of them are bilaterally approved by both the countries, or some of them are only prepared by India. But that is not the legal text. So if there is any mismatch, it will not have a legal standing. One needs to look at the actual position of the MLI. Now, of course, today, if I am a signatory to the MLI, does it mean that all my tax treaties are modified? No. If when you are signing your MLI, you need to choose which treaties you wish to modify, and then there are various options and notifications, and we'll come to that, which sort of gives some sort of flexibility to countries. Now, how does the MLI actually work? Is the MLI works when on a matching principle basis. So let's take a scenario of India and Singapore. India has signed the MLI on a particular date. It has modified. It is effective from a particular date. If Singapore has also signed the MLI and it has included, so India has included, India has included 93 jurisdictions in its document. So most of its tax treaties are covered in the India saying that I wish to amend 93 tax treaties in the MLI through the MLI. Now, in that, Singapore is included. Or let's take the example of, say, Mauritius. Sorry, India has included Mauritius in its tax treaty list. So India is saying I want to modify the India-Mauritius tax treaty. On the other hand, Mauritius has not included India in its final tax treaty list of tax treaties to be modified by the MLI. Because of this, the MLI will not amend the India-Mauritius tax treaty because it works on a matching principle. Both countries have to agree that this is the tax treaty that we wish to modify through the MLI. And if there is a match, then only would the MLI impact that particular tax treaty. So similar to Mauritius, even Germany has not included India's tax treaties in their list. So therefore, you have your India, Germany, India, Mauritius treaty, which will not be impacted by the MLI as of now. Of course, India, US and India, Brazil treaty also, because US and Brazil are not signatories to the MLI, even those MLIs are not impacted. Even those treaties, are not impacted by the MLI. Now, there are certain terms that we'll come to, but just one term here before that we'll discuss is what is a covered tax agreement. Because throughout one, if one reads the MLI, throughout the agreement, throughout the entire instrument, one sees called a CTA, covered tax agreement. What is a covered tax agreement? And one sees a contracting jurisdiction. A covered tax agreement is nothing but a DTAA which has been amended or modified by the MLI. So an impacted DTAA would be considered as a covered tax agreement. And how in a tax treaty you have contracting state. In for the MLI, the parties to the covered tax agreement would be called as contracting jurisdictions. Now, how does one look at, or how does one know whether now India has included 93 jurisdictions? What about the other country which has included? How does one know, and what are the key positions, etc., that has that the other country has taken, whether it will apply? Because again, on just the fact that India has chosen and the other country has also chosen the same treaty to be modified doesn't automatically modify the tax treaty. There are various options and reservations and notifications process that is there. So how does one know that? And therefore one has the OECD matching data, MLI matching database, which is updated. So I've taken a screenshot of this. You can see it's updated till August 11. So here you can see India-Singapore tax treaty. So India signed the tax treaty in 2017. It has ratified it in 2000, deposited the final document in 2019. Singapore also has included India in its list, and therefore, if you can see Article 2, whether it's a covered tax agreement, the agreement would be considered as a covered tax agreement. So so this one can go in this on this link because that has, and and on the OECD website also, like how India has deposited its document of all its positions in respect of the MLI. All other countries have also done that. So one can always refer to that as the position. One can refer to the position that have been taken by the other countries. Now, when is the MLI effective? Yeah. So how? What is the process? So first, you need to sign the MLI. Then there is a process of ratification of the MLI, but which is not so much, not so relevant in India, where typically in a lot of countries one needs to go to the parliament to ratify a tax treaty, whereas India has given the powers to CBDT to ratify to enter into tax treaties. Then one needs to deposit the final MLI along with its list of reservations and options. Now, what is reservation option? We'll come to that later. Once you have done that, then for withholding taxes, it applies in the year after both the countries have deposited the ratified MLI, and for other taxes, it begins after 6 months after both the countries have deposited the ratified MLI. So in this particular scenario, let's take this example, India, Singapore. You can see both India and Singapore have signed in 2017. Singapore has deposited the final multilateral instrument along with its reservation notification for its final position in 2018, whereas India has done it only in 2019. So therefore, for when does it come into play? When does it effective? For it will apply in the first financial year, starting after the last country between both of them. So between India and Singapore, after the financial year or the calendar year. So then it is a calendar year, but India has chosen it to be considered as a financial year. So it will apply in the first financial year beginning after the deposit, the instrument has been deposited by both the countries. So therefore, the MLI will apply in respect of India for the India-Singapore Treaty from 1st of April 2020. Obviously, Singapore, because it follows a calendar year, the first taxable period, which begins after June 2019, which is the last date on which between both the countries the MLI was deposited, that will be Jan 2020. So 1st Jan 2020, Singapore can start applying the MLI. India can start applying the MLI from 1st April 2020. A lot of India's tax treaties have been amended from 1st April 2020. So the MLI is already effective as on today for a lot of tax treaties, and therefore one needs to go and see whether when one reads tax treaties, one needs to read the MLI as well. to see if there is any modification and if it is it is already having an impact on the existing tax treaty that one is reading. Now, we have seen when is the entry into force is once the signatory once you submit your the final ratified document. A cover tax agreement, we have seen what is a cover tax agreement. Now, what is a reservation and choice? So basically, as we saw earlier, there were 100 countries which are participating. Obviously, it is not possible that all the 100 countries will agree on the same thing for all. There are almost approximately 30 articles on various aspects, on the functioning of MLA, etc. So all the countries may not really agree on all the issues on all the aspects, etc. of the of one this thing, because obviously there are each one has its own rationale and reason. So therefore, what the OECD has done is they have said, okay, there are certain things which are minimum standards. There are 2 or 3 things which are minimum standards where the moment you're a signatory to the MLI, that provision has to apply. Otherwise, you can choose not to apply a particular article of the MLI to your tax duties. So you can reserve the right to not, you can give a list, you can consider it as a part of your reservation. So you will reserve the right not to apply the MLI to that particular to your tax treaties, but that particular article of the MLI to your particular tax treaties. Similarly, for example, there is Article 3 in respect of transparent entities, and India has chosen not to apply the article, and it has reserved its right not to apply the Article 3 to any of its tax treaties. So therefore, in that case, none of Indian tax treaties will be modified by Article 3 of the MLI. Then there is a option, because obviously, there will be various options, having various aspects. So there will be options that may be given in some of these articles, and you can choose which option to apply. And because of the matching principle, typically it would be that, for example, if India has opted for option A, then it would apply in respect of, say, India, Singapore, only if Singapore also has opted for option A. Obviously, there are certain articles which allow, and we'll come to that, which allow asymmetric application also, where, even if the same options are not selected, it can apply. But otherwise, as a matter of principle, if both the countries choose the same option, only then would the MLI be amended or modified. Then you need to notify which are the existing provisions in your tax treaties which are going to be amended by the MLI. And the entry into effect of MLI, we have seen that it applies for the first day of the financial year after the date of signing of the date on which the last country to that contracting to the DTAA has submitted its document. Now, we have seen what is the cover tax agreement. We have seen, now let's look at some of the terms which are related to interpretation, and then we'll come to the examples or the articles which are amended, which are amending the tax treaties. We have seen what is the cover tax agreement, what is the contracting jurisdiction. There is something called as a compatibility clause. So in each article, which is the substantive article, which deals with the changes in the tax treaties, it provides of how the article of the MLI will interact with the article in the tax treaty. Then there is language used as in place of, in absence of. So in place of means the existing article of the MLI will apply in place of. It will completely replace the existing language in the tax treaty, or in absence of. So if that tax treaty does not have that particular language, then the MLI language will be added to the tax treaty. In place of or in absence of means either way, whether that language is there or not there, the MLI language will apply. So that's how the compatibility clauses, etc. works. We have seen what is reservation and option. We'll not deal with transparent entities because it is not really relevant to India, because India has opted not to apply. But just suffice to say that, basically what it seeks to do is what it says is under the tax treaty as well, that the benefit of a tax treaty will be given only in respect of transparent entities, only if the partner or the person who's going to be finally taxed is also a resident of that country. Otherwise, you will not get the benefit of the tax treaty. So India has chosen not to apply this. Let's look at dual resident, where India has chosen to apply. So dual resident. So as we know, firstly, you have residence under the domestic tax law, and in respect of a person who becomes a resident of both the contracting states, under the tax treaty. If you are an individual, then you have a detailed mechanism that is given. So where does your economic interest lie? Where are your personal interests in which country? Where do you have a habitual abode, a permanent home? Which country are you a citizen of, etc. So that determines where does the tie break in favor of which country in respect of a tax treaty. So you have your dual resident, in respect of dual resident individuals, you have a particular, what we just mentioned. However, in respect of entities other than individuals, say companies, then you have generally Article 4(3) of a tax treaty, which provides that in respect of a person who other than an individual, if it is a dual resident, then it will be deemed to be a resident of the country where the poem is there. So generally, the poem is the tiebreaker in most of the tax treaties, and that is only for the purpose of tax treaty. Now, so similarly, let's take this example here. A Limited is incorporated in UK, and it has its poem in India. Let's say because of the shareholder and the managing director, etc., had come down to India before the pandemic, and they were stuck here, and they were taking decisions from here. Therefore, there's a poem also triggering in India. Earlier, what would happen is, because of the tiebreaker rule, one would apply the tiebreaker, etc., and see where the tiebreak would be in favor of India, for example. Now, what it's saying is, now because of what it says is that now the tiebreaker will in respect of individuals, the tiebreaker as is there will continue, but for entities other than an individual, now it will apply only by application by discussion between the competent authorities. So the competent authorities of both the countries shall determine which country is that entity a resident of for the purpose of tax treaty, and till then the entity will not get any treaty benefit until and unless the competent authorities of both the countries, so in this case India and UK, they determine of which country will A Limited be considered a resident of, the treaty benefit will not be available at all. You have existing tax treaties with Japan and Canada, which have a similar language. But because this MLI Article 4 applies in place of or in absence of, so that the MLI language would override, to the extent it is incompatible, it would override the existing language in the India, Japan, and India, Canada DTAA as well. With respect to China, China is not a covered tax agreement, because at that time India was negotiating a tax treaty with China. But the newly incorporated tax treaty has this language, because at the time of negotiation, MLI was already there. So while India has not included China in its list of this thing, and therefore it is not a covered tax agreement, the DTAA already covers this newly negotiated language that is there. Now, how will the competent authorities decide? So the OECD commentary 2017 provides some guiding factors for competent authorities to take into consideration for determining the residential status of a dual resident entity other than an individual. So place where the board of directors meeting takes place where the senior executives carry out the activities, or senior management activities carried out, or where the headquarters are situated. So these are sort of criteria that are given. But these are just sort of guiding factors, but one sees that they are similar to what the poem regulations, etc., would be, as per the treaty. But it also obviously includes countries whose laws govern the legal status of the person, etc. So it also sort of includes the country of incorporation. But these are just sort of guiding principles that are given. The competent authorities, it depends on how the negotiation between the competent authorities takes place, and it cannot necessarily be on a completely scientific basis. Now let's look at, so having seen what Article 4, now let's look at Article 5. As we know, there are two methods to eliminate double taxation: the exemption method and the credit method. Now, as we know, India generally in most of its tax treaties follows the tax credit method. However, there are a lot of countries, mainly the European countries, which follow the exemption method. Under the exemption method, if an income is earned outside that particular country, then the country of residence generally exempts that income and gives the full right of taxation to the country of source. Now, there are some tax treaties with India which have the exemption method. So let's look at that example here. So, India's tax treaties, Greece, Egypt, Bulgaria, Slovakia have the exemption method in the tax treaty. Now, here let's look at an example here. B Limited, a Bulgarian entity, pays royalty to A Limited, which is an Indian entity. But this royalty is connected to a permanent establishment of A Limited in Bulgaria. Now, under the tax treaty of India, Bulgaria, Bulgaria obviously has a right, because there's a permanent establishment in Bulgaria, Bulgaria has a right to tax the profits of such PE. Under Article 25 of the DTAA of India and Bulgaria, India needs to exempt such profits of the permanent establishment from Indian tax. So India will not tax it and then give credit for the taxes paid in Bulgaria, but India will completely exempt this. And because it is provided in the tax treaty, it will override any provisions in the act, etc. And so therefore, the profits of the PE earned in Bulgaria would be completely exempt under the Indian tax laws because of the DTAA. Now, this could result in a lot of sorry, this could result in a lot of tax planning, aggressive tax planning, where I can choose a country. So say, I mean, of course, India mainly follows the credit method, so it's not as relevant for us. But if if it was not India, it was say Netherlands, for example, which follows the exemption method, then I could always choose a country because PE is on the basis of certain facts. So I could always have a PE in a country which has very low tax. And in such a scenario, I would ensure that in that low tax country, I will pay some minimum tax. But in the country of residence, which is say Netherlands, because it follows the exemption method, I will not end up paying any tax. So I will get away with a minimum tax. So therefore, now the MLI says, hold on, you need to change. Now the exemption method should no longer hold good. You need to adopt the credit method. Obviously, it's not a compulsion. So countries can choose to reserve to not to choose this article as well. But so you can, but typically it tries to discourage the use of the exemption method and says that give the use a credit method. Now, of course, there are various options that are given in the in Article 5. Mainly, it is because of different streams of income. So, one is in respect of credit method can only apply in respect of say dividend income, or only in respect of PE income. So, because of the way each country may have wanted. So, there are options that are given. Now, what I had told you in the starting, that it applies a matching principle. So therefore, if both the countries have chosen the option, only then it would apply. That is the normal rule. Now, your Article 5 provides an asymmetric approach, where if a country has adopted one of the option and India has adopted another option, because the MLI allows an asymmetric approach application of MLI for Article 5, one can choose to apply say India adopted option C and Bulgaria has opted option B. So whichever country is giving the tax credit, say India will continue applying option C in respect of that tax credit, whereas Bulgaria can continue choosing option B. So that allows a sort of an asymmetric application. Now coming into action 6, we have seen prevention of treaty abuse. So there are about 5 or 6 items which are there in the which are in the action point, which deal with sorry, there are 5 or 6 articles in the MLI which deal with the proposition of action plan 6, which refer to prevention of treaty abuse. So we will cover that one by one, but just this slide is just to highlight that there is purpose of a covered tax agreement, which is the preamble of a treaty. That is a minimum standard under the MLI. So the moment a country signs the MLI, the purpose of the covered tax agreement is a minimum standard, so it automatically applies. A country cannot choose not to apply that particular article, which is Article 6. Similarly, Article 7, prevention of treaty abuse, you have various options. You have the principal purpose test, and we'll come to that. Principal purpose test or the simplified LOB test, etc., which can apply. Now, there the principal purpose test is the minimum standard. So the countries can choose to add and simplified LOB clause also. They can adopt that, but the principal purpose test is a minimum standard that needs to be adopted. The other articles, obviously, we will be dealing with them individually as well in the subsequent slides. Right. Coming to Article 6, which is a minimum standard. So, as you know, every tax treaty has a preamble which starts off in the tax treaty, that this tax treaty is for the purpose of eliminating double taxation and for improving the economic conditions between both the countries and the investment conditions between both the countries, etc. Now, that sort of provides a context to the tax treaty. So what Article 6 seeks to seeks to do is, it seeks to add a particular language, and that is just listed here. So what the preamble of the tax treaty is to be worded as is to the purpose of the tax treaty is to eliminate double taxation without creating opportunities for non-taxation or reduced taxation through tax evasion or avoidance, including through treaty shopping arrangements. So this elimination of double taxation was always there, but now the language or the purpose of the tax treaty is amended, that the tax treaty does not provide opportunities for double non-taxation or reduced taxation through use of tax avoidance schemes, including, they have specifically talked about treaty shopping arrangements. Now, how does it really impact a tax treaty? When one is interpreting various terms of a tax treaty, one needs to always keep in mind the context with which the tax treaty was entered into. Therefore, now one would also keep in mind the anti-avoidance rule that is coming, because of the change in the way the preamble is. So the purpose of the tax treaty is not to provide opportunity for double non-taxation through tax avoidance. So when one is interpreting various terms in the tax treaties, one will need to keep that in mind while interpreting the tax treaty. So that is the amendment through Article 6. It is a minimum standard, like I said, and therefore all the tax treaties would be modified. Then we come to the principal purpose test. The principal purpose test, like I said, is a minimum standard. There is also an option for countries to apply the principal purpose test along with something called as a simplified LOB provision, or instead of, so that is an option, or you can apply a detailed LOB, which is, but instead of the principal purpose test or SOB. So you can choose not to apply the minimum standard only if you apply a detailed LOB test. Now, none of the countries have opted for this detailed LOB. Now, first, let's come to the principal purpose test, and then we'll go to what is the SLOB, etc. The principal purpose test seeks to deny treaty benefits in respect of an item of income if one of the principal purposes of the arrangement or transaction is to obtain treaty benefits, unless granting the benefit is in accordance with the object and purpose of the relevant tax treaty. Now, as we can see, this language is almost similar with the GAR provisions that we have in our domestic tax law, but there are some changes. There are some differences between the GAR and the principal purpose test. Firstly, the language of GAR is if the principal or if the main purpose of an arrangement is to obtain a benefit, then GAR applies. Whereas principal purpose test refers to if one of the principal purposes is to obtain a treaty benefit. Now, that is one. Secondly, in respect of GAR, there is a specific procedure that is given where an assessing officer can apply GAR. He needs to follow a certain specified procedure in order to apply GAR. There is no such procedure or anything that is required for the PPT. Another aspect is the GAR has a grandfathering clause, whereas there is no such grandfathering provided in a PPT. So for GAR, if you have investments made before 1st April 2017, GAR shall not apply. However, there is no such grandfathering provided to a PPT. But like GAR, again, PPT is a very subjective. Of course, PPT is wider because of one of the principal purposes, etc. So it is very wide. It is very broad and generic. You also have the simplified LOB, which we'll come to in the subsequent slides. The simplified LOB provides a very objective test criteria to obtain tax treaty benefits, whereas the PPT is broad and generic. Now it is a minimum standard, so it applies across all tax treaties. SLOB only applies when it is permitted by the other jurisdiction. So both the countries have opted, then only SLOB will apply, whereas PPT applies in respect of all the tax treaties. But it is interesting to note, that how does PPT interact with GAR? So possibly, with GAR and PPT in place, how do they interact with each other? So you have your GAR provisions, so possibly one, and again, GAR has a minimum threshold, whereas PPT does not have a threshold. So PPT can apply even from say ₹1 or $1 of a transaction, whereas in GAR you have a particular threshold that needs to be met of a minimum 3 crores of tax. So today, therefore, one needs to see possibly how does GAR interact with the PPT rules. So it may result in a position where the GAR may not apply, GAR provisions may not apply, but the PPT would still deny the tax treaty benefits. Another important difference between GAR and PPT is GAR recharacterizes the transaction, whereas PPT is silent. It doesn't talk about any recharacterization, etc. of the transaction. So there are significant differences between GAR and PPT. So therefore, today going forward, and this is just one part of when one is certifying 15 CB, etc. Just having a tax residency certificate will no longer be sufficient. One needs to see whether PPT is applicable, not applicable. I think, of course, this is something, how, because the subjective test, how does one apply, especially when one is issuing form 15 CB, whether declaration, etc. can be taken. That is something I'm sure Siddharth would be covering in the next session, I think, which will be taking next week. But yes, this is something that has definitely, because of the subjective test, there is an issue. How does one apply it? How do tax authorities apply it? Because today, anyone can apply this principal purpose test. Let's look at some examples. And sorry, just one more important, before we look at the examples, one more important difference between GAR and PPT. In GAR, there are two conditions. One is there has to be a benefit that has to be taken, and second is the main purpose has to be in respect of taking a benefit. And second, there is a tainted element test. So only if the tainted element test is present, then only along with the benefit, then GAR will apply. PPT does not seek to do any of that. So PPT seems to be much wider than GAR in that sense. It does not require there to be a tainted element. But the question is, would that not be an inherent sort of requirement, because PPT is coming as a sort of if I may say so, it is an anti-avoidance rule. So therefore, is there an inherent thing that there has to be a tainted element, for PPT to apply? That is a possible view, but of course, one will need to wait and see how it is interpreted by various tax authorities to see how PPT has to actually apply and how it is being actually applied. So let's take an example where, in this case, ARCO is a company which is a resident of state R and has held, say, 24% of the shares of ESCO. Now, there is a treaty that is being signed between R and S. So ARCO will be able to avail lower rate of tax on dividends if the shareholding is at least 25%. So ARCO decides that it has to increase its shareholding to 25%, and it realizes that it has one of its group entities which is holding these shares. So therefore, it acquires these shares from the group entity. And there are a lot of countries where there is no taxation on capital gains arising from transfer of shares in the same group, etc. So assuming that that is the case, because then it does not result in taxation for the group entity to sell the shares, then ARCO is able to get a lower rate of tax for the ARCO is able to get the lower rate of tax for the dividends that will be declared by ESCO to ARCO. Now, obviously, if the facts and circumstances reveal that the decision has one of the principal purpose is obviously to obtain the treaty benefit, because the idea of acquiring this while it is in the same group, the idea of acquiring this is to obtain a lower rate of tax under the tax treaty for dividends, especially now that DDT, etc. has been abolished. Then yes, it will be considered as one of the principal purposes. But let's take an example that ignore the last para that the facts and circumstances reveal that. Let's take a scenario where before so India, let's assume that ESCO is an Indian company. Okay, so the company paying the dividends is Indian company. So if in that scenario, where you had DDT in place, so at that time, this was before 1st April 2020, ARCO decided to acquire shares out from its group company, and because of which its shareholding increased about 25%. So at that time, there was DDT already in place. Now, subject to that whole discussion of whether DTAA overrides the DDT provisions or not, leaving that discussion aside, assuming today that the DDT provisions are not restricted by the or were never restricted by the tax duty, taking that view, if ARCO had increased its shareholding at a time when there was DDT anyway in place, so there was no real tax benefit that was sought to be achieved at that point of time. Now, after that, DDT has been abolished, and one has gone back to the classical system of taxation. Then yes, one will be able to argue that the principal purpose was one of the principal purpose was never to obtain any tax benefit, but it was for some other reason altogether. So therefore, it really depends on facts and circumstances of the case to determine whether one of the principal purpose is to obtain a tax benefit or not. Then you have ARCO, which is in example 2, an ARCO, which is company resident of state R, which is manufacturing electronic devices. Now it is seeking to open a manufacturing plant to benefit from the lower manufacturing cost. Now, after choosing, after doing a preliminary review, there are 3 possible locations that have been identified. And after that, the company decides that because one of the location has a treaty with state R, therefore they would be opting for that. Now, now the question is the principal purpose, can the principal purpose test be triggered by this sort of a discussion? Now, obviously in GAR, you have the FAQs, you have the choice principle that is there, where it says that, if there are multiple ways of achieving a particular, objective, and one chooses, and with the same, with the same economic substance, etc., one chooses a route which is sort of leading to, which would result in a sort of a lower taxation than the other options, that does not trigger GAR, because it's a choice principle how to choose that. Now, that sort of choice principle is not there in the PPT test. So it is very wide. So possibly, yes, one can apply, but in my view, while the language is not there, because it's an anti-avoidance provision, I think you cannot apply a PPT test so widely as to ignore the commercial reality. And obviously, if there are multiple options that are available with the economic substance being there in each of the options, obviously tax is and as we all know, that tax is one of the driver. It may not be the key driver. It would obviously, because it's a cost, it would be one of the drivers of making a particular decision. So that should not necessarily trigger the PPT. But like I said, because it is so wide, so subjective, so open-ended, one needs to wait and see, possibly after the first stage of assessment is done for assessment financial year 2021, which is the first year which the PPT test would apply, to see how this PPT test evolves, how do various tax authorities, as well as various courts interpret these sort of provisions. You also have, the third example is similar, where there's a choice principle involved. Again, my view is that, if there's a choice after, having looked at all the other economic criteria and all the other conditions, and in each of the choice also, the choice I'm selecting, there is some substance in what I'm doing, then possibly one may be able to take a view that the principal purpose test should not apply. Then we have the simplified LOB provision. The simplified LOB, like I said, is so like when we had the PPT test, which was a subjective criteria. Just one second, sorry. So the PPT test, one had the subjective criteria. The simplified LOB or the SLOB has an objective criteria to allow to provide treaty benefits. So SLOB provides, the Article 7 on SLOB provides that treaty benefits shall be provided to whom? To qualified person. Now, who is a qualified person? A qualified person means an individual or the contracting state, political division, etc. a company which is regularly traded on a recognized stock exchange, NGOs, pension funds, or an entity where the at least 50% of the shares are held by the qualified person. That is a qualified person. Then treaty benefits can apply to qualified person or a person who is not a qualified person, but entities which are not qualified, but engaged in active conduct of business in the country. What is active conduct of business? We'll come to a little later. Or it can apply to entities with more than 75% holding by equivalent beneficiaries for half the days in any 12-month period. Now, who is equivalent beneficiary? So basically, look at it from a treaty shopping perspective. An entity in country A is investing in an entity in country B, and it in turn is investing in an entity in country C. Now, an equivalent beneficiary. Now, one is looking at whether the treaty between B and C will apply. So, in this scenario, the question is whether the entity in country B, which is the intermediate company, will be considered as a qualified person, or will it be eligible for treaty benefits of the treaty with country B, of country B's treaties with country C, etc. Now, the country A shareholder, if he had, let's take a scenario, if he had invested directly in country C, the tax would have been the same, or it would have been similar or even lower rate of tax if he had invested directly. But because of whatever commercial reason, etc., he has invested through country B. Now, obviously, there, even though the shareholding is not held by a qualified person, but it is held by a person who would have been subject to a higher rate of tax if he would have invested directly in the operating company, and therefore there is no real tax benefit that is sought to be achieved by doing an intermediate holding company, for example, and therefore this would be considered as an equivalent beneficiary. Now we talked about what is an active conduct of business. Active conduct of business shall not include a holding company or a supervisory company which provides cash pooling entities that you have, or entities which only sort of manage investments, unless they are a bank, insurance companies, or registered security dealers, which is dealing in the ordinary course of business. Now, the Article 7 also provides that if SLOB is not satisfied, one can go approach the competent authorities for selection of proper opting for availing the treaty benefits, where they can on the request to the competent authorities under mutual agreement procedure, they can determine if the entity would be eligible for obtaining the treaty benefits or not. Now, the PPT test works along with the SLOB. So even if the SLOB test has been satisfied, technically the PPT applies. But that being said, if the SLOB is satisfied, possibly one may be able to take a view that, and of course, it depends on each stream of income, because PPT test, as we have seen here, PPT seeks to deny treaty benefits in respect of a particular item of income, whereas the SLOB only tries to say that you will be eligible for treaty benefits overall for the entire treaty. So one needs to see, even if SLOB is satisfied, are you undertaking a particular transaction with one of the principal purposes to achieve tax benefit, then PPT test may also apply there. Now, India has said that PPT is an interim measure. It has intended to adopt LOB, expressed its intent to adopt LOB through bilateral negotiation. Then India has also adopted the SLOB along with a mutual agreement, but most of the other countries have not adopted the SLOB. So therefore, very few treaties, for example, with Norway and Norway and Russia, would be impacted with the SLOB. But PPT would apply in all of the treaties which are covered tax agreement for India. Now, what other action plan 6 talks about? What other issues? So this is just a screenshot of one of the articles of a tax treaty. The dividend article, Article 10(1) typically says that the dividends can be taxed in the country of residence. 10(2) provides that allows the country of source to tax the dividends, but it says if the beneficial owner is a resident of the contract, is a resident state, then the tax shall not exceed X% and Y%. So typically, most tax treaties only provide one rate of tax under Article 10(2), but some treaties which follow the UN and OECD model, provide two different rates of tax. So in this particular scenario, you're seeing, and this is the India-Singapore Treaty, which says that the rate of tax shall not exceed 10% if the shareholder who owns at least 25% of the shares, or else it shall not exceed 15%. So it provides sort of a participation exemption or a participation reduction of taxation, if you are holding a particular percentage. Now, what would happen? Again, we're talking about scenarios, certain jurisdictions where there is no capital gains tax where transaction is between the same group, etc. So, if there is a company which is holding, say, less than 25%, so let's say that there is a group company, two group companies holding 20% shares. Now, if the Indian company paying the dividend to its shareholders, which hold 20% each, the tax rate under domestic tax law is 20% plus surcharge cess, but under the treaty would be 15%, because you need to look at why each shareholder, and because each shareholder does not hold more than 25% of the shares, therefore the rate of tax would be 15%. Now let's take a scenario where the shares are transferred from one entity to the other, merely to sort of get this benefit, uh, and then they are transferred back. So at the time just before the dividend is declared, and then they are transferred back to the other entity, so that combined there is a one entity which is holding 40%. So therefore that would result in a lower rate of tax, and India would be able to tax only at 10%. Now, what Article 8 seeks to do, it says that the ownership conditions, which is 25% holding in a company, which is paying the dividends, need to be met throughout a 365-day period, including the day of payment of the dividends. So therefore, what it seeks to say is, are you holding the shares for 365 days, including the date of payment of the dividends? Then only will you get a benefit of the lower rate of tax under 10(2)(a). If not, you can still opt for a lower rate of taxes per treaty, but it will be under 10(2)(b) and not 10(2)(a), because you are not having a minimum holding that is required. So sorry, there's one more aspect here. Okay, so we'll come to that probably a little later. Yeah. Now Article 9. Article 9 seeks, so you have Article 13, which provides for capital gains of a tax. Article 13 of a tax will provide for capital gains. Now, what Article 9 of the MLI says is, so in the tax treaties, where, for example, India Netherlands treaty, where under certain circumstances the transfer of shares, capital gains arising from transfer of shares is also not taxable. Now, what it says is, even those tax treaties provide that if the shares of the Indian company which is transferred derive their value principally from immovable property situated in India, then India will have a right to tax this. So therefore, and so derive principally from immovable property, if the shares are derived value principally from immovable property situated in the source state, then the source state has a right to tax this. Now, this condition of immovable property was only available or was only earlier was possible only in case of companies, only where shares were sold. So what if interest in an LLP is assigned, or any other entity, sort of entity, these sort of because it talks about transfer of shares, that was not there. So just take an example of Indian LLP, where the interest in an Indian LLP is transferred or assigned. Then even though the immovable property it derives its value mainly from immovable property situated in India, the assignment of the transfer of the LLP interest may not be taxable under the tax treaty, under the erstwhile regime, under the erstwhile treaty. Now, what Article 9 seeks to do is, it seeks to sort of put on an equal footing shares of a company as well as comparable interest of a partnership firm, LLP, or a trust, etc. So sort of gives an equal footing, whichever entity it is. If the value of the entity, if you're transferring interest in a particular entity, whether by way of shares or partnership interest or whatever, if the principal value of that entity is derived from an immovable property situated in a particular source state, then that source state will have a right to tax it. Now, what if one takes a view that, okay, so I will transfer the immovable property because it only talks about more than, if the principal value of the shares is derived from immovable property situated in India. So what if I just transfer the immovable property to say another entity, so then I get cash. So I don't have an immovable property situated in India right now at the date of transfer, and therefore I do not, India cannot have a right to tax this. So there again, how we had for Article 8, you have Article 9(4), which provides that if you are so what Article 9(4) says is, firstly it provides that India has a right to tax the gains where the immovable property is situated if the shares or comparable interest that we saw, such as interest in a partnership or trust or transfer, and if they derive more than 50% value of immovable property in that country at any time during the preceding 365 days. Therefore, similar to what we saw in dividends, if in the preceding 365 days, if you held an immovable property and you transferred that, then it will be considered as if you had from the date of transfer of the shares. If you held immovable property, then it will be considered as the source rate where the immovable property is situated, having a right to tax the capital gains. Now, interestingly, just one point I want to highlight: the difference between the period holding between Article 9 and Article 8 that we saw earlier. Article 9 talks about the holding of immovable property during any time during the preceding 365 days. So preceding the date of transfer. Whereas Article 8 does not say that. It says that the ownership conditions need to be met throughout a 365 day, including the date of payment. So let's take a scenario where shares are acquired, say on 1st of Jan, dividend is paid, say in May or June. So as on the date of payment, I am not satisfying the 365-day period, but I continue holding the shares for beyond December and whatever. Then I'm satisfying the 365-day period because it is 365-day period including the date of payment of dividends, any 365-day period, and therefore in dividends this is a straddled holding period. I can that benefit one can take a view that benefit can be given, so I can be taxed at the lower rate of tax, even though on the date of dividend I have not really satisfied that holding condition. Now, of course, in case of Section 195, how it would apply, possibly one may not be able to take such a liberal interpretation of 195 because you don't know what is going to happen in the future. So possibly one may need to, say that, I'll look at 365-day preceding, but that is only for 195. Obviously, nothing is stopping the recipient from filing, its return of income and claiming the refund for the taxes that is paid, if it satisfies the 365-day period afterwards. Coming into Article 10, PE in a third state. Now, again, this is again a very, a unique article. So let's take a scenario. And this was, something that was done in the past, using Luxembourg. Now I'm using Netherlands and UK as examples, just examples. But, in the past, there were these financing structures which were used using Luxembourg, Switzerland, etc., which was significantly used and resulted in sort of a very low tax. And we'll come to that. So let's take a scenario where B Limited, a company in India, is making a payment of royalty to A Limited, which is a resident of Netherlands. Now, under the India-Netherlands tax treaty, assuming that the tax rate is say 10%, as per the Netherlands tax law, the royalty that is received is supposed to be taxed at 25%. But we have come to know that this intangible in respect of which the royalty is paid is housed in a permanent establishment of A Limited in the UK. Therefore, now UK will also have a right to tax it. So now India will tax under India-Netherlands treaty at 10%. UK will seek to tax the profits of the PE assumed at 10% for the moment. Now UK will give credit for the taxes that are paid in India because UK is also taxing it. So UK will give the credit for the taxes paid in India following the non-discrimination clause, etc. So UK will not be able to tax anything because India has already taxed 10%. UK also wants to tax 10%. Now, you're in a scenario where, where we saw in Article 5 that certain countries follow the exemption method. So if Netherlands follows the exemption method, Netherlands will say, okay, I will, because it's the profits of a PE situated in a country outside India, I will not seek to tax. I will give an exemption for the profits of the PE. So Netherlands will not tax this. Now this resulted in a situation where India will say, when I had negotiated a treaty with Netherlands, I had agreed to give up my right of taxation from say 20 or 25% to 10%. I'll come down to 10% because on the understanding that Netherlands is going to tax it because Netherlands is the country of recipient. However, because of this structure where there is a PE of another, where the asset is transferred to a PE of another state, and therefore Netherlands is giving an exemption, and therefore nobody is Netherlands is not taxing me. So why should I give up my right of taxation? So Article 10 says that if the tax rate in Netherlands, or rather, if the tax rate in UK, which is the PE state, is less than 60% of the potential tax that would have been there in Netherlands if it was paid directly, and if Netherlands exempts the profits of the permanent establishment, then in that scenario, India, which is the country making the payment, is not restricted from is not required to give the treaty benefit. So India can follow its domestic tax law because in this particular scenario, India has given up its right of taxation on the assumption that Netherlands is going to tax it. But if Netherlands is not going to tax it and UK is also taxing it at such a low rate, then it is not fair for India to give up its share of taxation. Therefore, India will be able to tax it without any restricted by a tax treaty. That is what Article 10 says. Now, it is a very, when a per entity is making a payment, how does one really apply it is something that leads to a lot of questions. Because if B Limited is making a payment to A Limited, firstly, how would I know whether there is a PE situated in another state? Similarly, I would need to know what is the tax rate in Netherlands. I would need to know what is the tax rate in UK for a PE, etc. And what is the actual tax that is being paid? How do I determine all this? This is a very, in theory, it's a good article. It sort of seeks to avoid, plug some certain loopholes, or seeks to at least sort of recharacterize or go give each contracting state its fair share of taxation. But how does one really apply it practically, I think, is a question that really comes up in this sort of an article. Article 11 is nothing but it just sort of resonates the belief again, saying that a country of residents always has the right to tax its own residents, and it is not restricted from taxing its own residents. Now we come to the PE permanent. Now we have looked at anti-avoidance of tax duties as a whole. Now we look at specific, permanent establishment articles which have been amended, and there are some structures, etc. So we look at that also, and how does it practically apply. So just one second. Right. So you have the dependent agent permanent establishment in Article 5, 5 generally, which provides that if there is a dependent agent and he habitually exercises an authority to conclude contracts in the other country, then the other country would have there would be a permanent establishment of the principal in that other country. So now what has changed, and we'll come to what has changed, and then we'll look at what is the impact of that. Therefore, there are two conditions. One needs to be, he needs to be a dependent agent. Secondly, he needs to habitually exercise an authority to conclude contracts. Now that habitually exercising an authority to conclude contracts has been replaced, and now it is now habitually either he concludes contracts or habitually plays the principal role leading to the conclusion of contracts, which are routinely concluded without material modification by the enterprise. Therefore, now it is moved from concluding contracts, authority to conclude contracts, to playing a principal role leading to the conclusion of the contract. So let's take an example. Now here you have Mr. X. Let's assume that he's a dependent agent, because there is some change in the way how dependent agent versus independent agent is, and we'll come to that separately. There's a separate example for that. Here you have Mr. X, who's a dependent agent in state S of ARCO, which is a resident of state R. Now Mr. X sends emails, makes telephone calls, and visits large organizations in state S, meets the customers. He convinces the customers to buy the products of ARCO. And once the customer is persuaded, Mr. X asked the customer to conclude the contract directly with ARCO where he will not participate. Now he's paid a commission, etc. Now the question is, would it lead to a permanent establishment before, and how does it impact? How is it impacted by BIPs? Now, before, one could argue that he does not have an authority to conclude contracts, and therefore, in this situation, there is no permanent establishment of ARCO in state S. While he's a dependent agent, he does not have an authority to conclude contracts. Now, how is it changed with MLI Article 12 coming in? Article 12 says, okay, even if he's not concluding contracts or does not have an authority to conclude contracts habitually, does he play a principal role in the leading to the conclusion of contracts? The answer is yes, because he's going in convincing the customers that you buy this product, this is how whatever it can be. The customer is persuaded by Mr. X, and therefore possibly he is playing a habitually. I mean, obviously assuming that it happens habitually. Now he is playing a principal role in the conclusion of the contract. So therefore, now in a post MLI or a post BEPS era, this particular transaction could result in a dependent agent PE of of ARCO in state S. Let's look at another example. Your Mr. Same thing. What if Mr. X is an employee? Or what if there's a fixed price range within which he can negotiate, or what is the standard contract? Now, this is not something that is new to the MLI. These are provisions that were there existing before as well, that even if there is a fixed price range, then also as long as he's going and convincing the customers today, as long as he's convincing the customers, possibly it is a view can be taken that he's still playing a principal role in the conclusion of the contract. He does not have to negotiate all the elements as long as he's trying to persuade the customer in respect of the major components of the contract. Then yes, there is a principal role that is being played here, even if there's a standard contract, because he's persuading the customers. Now, what if Mr. X is an employee? And there, if one reads the OECD commentary, an agent does not necessarily mean an agent and principal in that sense, but an agent means a person who is sort of representing somebody else. So therefore, even an employee who is representing his employer, which is ARCO in this case, can also trigger a dependent agent PE. If, of course, fixed place PE, etc. does not apply, then dependent agent PE can also apply in this situation. Now, let's take another example where there is no, where ARCO is say in a pharmaceutical business. Mr. X is a marketing agent and he visits the doctors in state S. So, he tells them that, this is the product, etc. There is no convincing done. He's just marketing the product. This is the benefit of the product. This is what is there. This is how it applies, etc. And then if the doctors are interested, then they can directly sign a contract with ARCO. Here, one can obviously pass, obviously pre-BEPS, there was no, conclusion of contracts. Even post MLI, one can argue that he is not playing a principal role in the conclusion of contract. He is only merely providing a marketing service. A marketing service does not playing a principal role in the leading to the conclusion of contract. So therefore, if he's not persuading, etc., the customers, possibly one may be able to take a view that there's no principal role leading to the conclusion of contract that is played by the agent. Now, we talked about the activities. Now let's look at what is changed in respect of a dependent. So we talked about what is conclusion of contract versus the principal role leading to the conclusion of contract. Now let's look at the first condition in respect of dependent agent. Pre-MLI, the language is an agent is independent if his activities are not devoted exclusively or almost exclusively on behalf of that enterprise. So now let's take an example and then we'll come to what is the change. Here you have Mr. X. Okay, let's assume that he's concluding contracts, or let's assume he's playing a habitual role in principal role in conclusion of contracts, because that condition is satisfied. Now we are only determining if he's dependent or not dependent, or if he's dependent or independent in that sense. Here let's take Mr. X. He is providing services to ARCO 1, ARCO 2, ARCO 3. All are residents of state R, and all are part of the same group of which Mr. X is a part of. So they're all part of the same group. They are closely related enterprise. Now, what is a closely related enterprise? We'll look at later. But this is closely related enterprise entities, effectively part of the same group. Now, let's see what happens pre-BEPS. Now, one needs to look at, and let's assume that 33% of Mr. X's business is done by ARCO 1 is done for ARCO 1, 33% for ARCO 2, and ARCO 3, 33%. Now, let's look at now you look at taxability. Now, obviously, taxability has to be each entity wise. So I look at ARCO 1. I'll say, is Mr. X are his activities devoted exclusively or almost exclusively for ARCO 1? The answer is no. Similarly, for ARCO 2 and ARCO 3, if I look at, are they exclusively or almost exclusively for the individual entities? The answer is a no. So therefore, one could take a view earlier that in such a scenario, the activities are of Mr. X are not exclusively, almost exclusively for that particular enterprise, and therefore he is not a dependent agent. Now, what changes because of the MLI? The MLI says that an agent would be independent if his activities are not devoted exclusively or almost exclusively on behalf of that enterprise, which is same, or other closely related enterprises. So it says that you combine the activities of all the closely related enterprises and then see, are you providing are you providing your agency activities wholly or almost exclusively to that group of closely related enterprises? Then you'll be considered as a dependent agent for each of those entities of that enterprise. So, you have your existing India-Singapore tax treaty also has a similar language, in fact, even before the MLI. But now post MLI, that will be amended. Most other tax treaties will also have this sort of a language. So, so now one needs to look at qua the group, which are basically closely related enterprises, and not qua each entity. Of course, the PE would still be qua each entity, but if you're exclusively, almost exclusively on behalf of the group, then you would be considered as having, each entity would be considered as having a PE. Now, there's another sort of, because of a particular language that is used in MLI, there is another, impact. Let's take a scenario where ARCO 1, ARCO 2, so before that, just one thing, who needs to be closely related enterprise is not just ARCO 1, ARCO 2, ARCO 3 don't need to be just related to each other, but even Mr. X needs to be related to ARCO 1, ARCO 2, and ARCO 3, because I'll just read the language. Just one second. Yeah, what it says is, where however a person acts exclusively or almost exclusively on behalf of one or more enterprise to which it is closely related. So the agent needs to be closely related enterprise with the principals. So for the MLI provision to be triggered. Now let's take another example where you have ARCO 1, ARCO 2, and Mr. X are closely related enterprises, where Mr. X undertakes an agency activities for ARCO 1 and ARCO 2. For ARCO 3, which is an independent party, which is nowhere related to the group, etc., he undertakes full-fledged distributorship of products. He purchases and sells the products all on a P2P basis. Now, the question is, now let's look at the numbers. ARCO 1, he does business of over 1,000 crores, ARCO 2 over 750 crores, and ARCO 3 over 500 crores. Now, what is exclusively, we looked at the language, if these activities are devoted exclusively or almost exclusively on behalf of the enterprise. So the commentary typically says approximately if 90% of your turnover, etc., is from that income is from that particular entity or now from that particular group, then you'll be considered as having activities undertaken exclusively or almost exclusively. Now, the question here is, so I'm carrying on in this particular example, I'm carrying on two separate activities. One is an agency activity for my group entities, where I'm doing exclusively for my group, and another is where I am doing, I'm also doing some other business. Now, if I combine both the businesses together, then am I wholly dependent on my group entities? The answer is no, because approximately 20-25% of my business is with the third party. So I'm not, triggering that 90% threshold, but if I look at only the agency activities, then I'm fully dependent on on my group entities. Now, earlier, there is a decision also, I think ITAT decision in the case of Galileo, which says that one needs to combine both the activities together and then see if you're dependent wholly for on that entity, and only if 90% or more or whatever of my activities on a combined basis of all my businesses, if it is taken together, and then if it is more than 90%, then I am considered to be a dependent agent. Now that changes because of the language of the MLI, and I'll just read it for the benefit of everyone. Para 1 shall not apply where the person acting in a contracting jurisdiction to a CTA on behalf of an enterprise of the other contracting jurisdiction carries on business in the first mentioned contracting jurisdiction as an independent agent and acts for the enterprise in the ordinary course of that business. So clearly now there's a change of language. Earlier it was in the ordinary course of the business. Now it is changed to in the ordinary course of that business. So by just changing one word, now the view that view may no longer hold good. And now one needs to see in respect of agency activities. So ignore the other businesses that Mr. X is carrying on. In respect of the agency activities, is he carrying on exclusively or almost exclusively for his group? Then it would be he would be considered as a dependent agent. Now, having looked at dependent agent PE, let's look at specific activities. So for a fixed place PE, you have the specific activity exemption in a tax treaty, generally Article 5(4), which provides that if you're using the fixed place of business, it will not be considered as a PE if it is the fixed place of business is used for, say, storage of goods or maintenance of goods for storage and display, or maintenance of goods for processing, or for collecting information, or maintenance of fixed place of or generally there is also for example maintenance of goods for delivery, or for generally and then there is the last clause, which is similar activities which have a preparatory or auxiliary character, or a combination of activities. Now what happens here is, if you look at A, B, C, D, E, now in respect of A, now the idea behind the specific activity exclusion is that ideally it is for the idea is that the activity carried on is preparatory or auxiliary, or it is so removed from the main business of the entity that it cannot trigger a PE, even though it is a fixed place, and therefore generally that exemption is given. So generally you have this fixed specific activity exemption that is used mainly in your liaison offices, etc. Where you say that you have a fixed place in respect of the liaison office, but I'm not carrying on business, but also I am only carrying on a preparatory or auxiliary activity. So the idea is to have these sort of exemptions for minor activities that are carried out. But the question is, minor activities for whom? It has to be minor activities overall in the whole value chain, or in respect of my business. So let's take an example and we look at that. Now you have A Limited, which is a resident of, say, Germany, or any other country for that matter. Actually, not Germany, it can be France, or where the MLI is impacted. And you have he owns a warehouse, and that warehouse is he owns a warehouse in India, and that warehouse is used for storage of goods. Now, if I look at the pre-MLI, position, the use of facilities solely for the storage or display of goods, or for delivery. Generally the article also provides for delivery. So I can fall under one of the articles here and say that I am clearly falling under the exception here, and therefore this warehouse will not be considered as a permanent establishment. But the question is, in respect of the overall business of A Limited, is having a warehouse a preparatory or auxiliary activity or not? The answer is no, because for an e-commerce operator or an e-commerce retailer, warehousing is an important aspect of that business, and therefore it is clearly not a preparatory or auxiliary activity or character that is carried out. So while earlier I could take a position, because why could I take the position? Because that preparatory or auxiliary character of the activity is not a condition that is used in A, B, C, D. It is only a condition that is used in E, which is for similar activities or a combination of activities. So therefore earlier I could have taken that position. Now what Article 13 says is, No, for each of those activities, or even for a combination of any of those activities, that activity has to be a preparatory or auxiliary activity in respect of your business. So therefore, now I will not be able to take a position because this warehousing activity, while it is purely storage of goods or display of goods, it is in respect of, it is not a preparatory or auxiliary activity in respect of my business, and therefore while pre-MLI I could have taken a position, possibly depending on the treaty language, that it falls under the specific exemption, activity exemption, and therefore there is no PE. But now, yes, it may trigger a permanent establishment. Similarly, you have for collection of information. So you have a social networking website which has an office in India. It monetizes the social media website through marketing, advertisement, etc. Now the question here uh, is collection of information. It collects the information, analyzes it, and then sends it to the head office in Germany, or it only collects the information and it does not analyze it. Now, in the first scenario, if it is collecting the information, analyzing it, looking at the language, maintenance of goods, or any other activity for collection of information. So, if you have a fixed place for collecting information, then you could possibly take a view that this does not fall under that. It falls under the specific activity exemption. But now with the amendment, because now the question is collecting information a preparatory or auxiliary activity for a social networking website? Definitely it is, because monetization of the social media is through marketing advertisement, which is coming through this sort of information that is coming. So therefore, possibly, now post the MLI, even collection of information is used to would trigger a permanent establishment. Then let's look at a scenario where I'll say, okay, I am I can do one thing, then I can split my activities between my group, and I will then say I will carry on, say, only warehousing. My other entity will carry on, say, other activity, and another entity subsidiary in the country state will carry out another activity. So I could obviously split my activities earlier within the group and ensure that each activity is a preparatory or auxiliary activity. Earlier I could have done that, but now the MLI Article 13 clearly says no. You have to look at closely related enterprises, and you have to look at all the activities carried out by closely related enterprises together in a particular contracting state. And if all the activities combined are still not of a preparatory or auxiliary character, then will there be no trigger of PE? If if they are not of a preparatory or auxiliary character, then they will be considered as a PE. Even if individual activity is preparatory or auxiliary, but on a combination of all the activities, it is not preparatory or auxiliary, there will be a permanent establishment trigger in India, even though I myself am only carrying on one small activity which may be preparatory or auxiliary. That's what Article 13 now seeks to amend. Then you have Article 14 of the MLI. Now you have your construction PE, supervisory PE, installation PE, which have a particular number of days that need to be satisfied in order to trigger the permanent establishment. So generally you have 90 days or 180 days. So if the project is being carried out for 180 days in a financial year, then there will be a permanent establishment. Just an example. This is typically what an installation or a construction PE typically triggers. Now, what can happen is I can split the activities within my group, and I will say again, I am carrying on X activity, somebody else is carrying on Y activity, somebody else is carrying on Z activity in respect of the same project, but such that I am less than 30, I am less than 180 days, he is less than 180 days, and the other person also less than 180 days. So each entity is less than 180 days. Now that again is something that is sought to be plugged by Article 14. It says that if you are carrying on activities for more than 30 days and the closely related enterprise is also carrying on for more than 30 days, then you need, in respect of the same project or a connected project, you need to combine the activities of carried out in that state in respect of the same project. And on that, if you exceed 180 days, then each entity which is carrying on activities for more than 30 days would have triggered a permanent establishment in that source state. Yes. So we have then we have Article 15. Now we have looked at what is we have seen that we need to aggregate the activities of the closely related enterprises. Now, therefore, the question is that who is a closely related enterprise? Now, closely related enterprise, there are two conditions, that either you control the other enterprise or you have common control, or even if you don't have a common control, if there is a 50% holding by you in the other enterprise or other enterprise holding in you, or a common entity holding 50% or more in both of the enterprises, then it will be considered as a closely related enterprise. On that note, so just to sum up, the MLI again is a vast document. It has various combinations, various, complexities involved, various nuances. And, what I have tried to do over the last hour and 45 minutes is to sort of just give a brief flavor of what is the key structures that the MLI is seeking to, discourage, and it is seeking to bring to tax certain structures which were otherwise getting out of the tax net because of aggressive tax planning. Obviously there are a lot of unintended consequences also because of the language that is used. It is not the easiest document to interpret, there are a lot of other issues, because especially the fact that it has to interact with an existing tax treaty. So how does that happen? That is another aspect that is there. So there are various complexities involved. Obviously now today, when the important thing is, as a practicing chartered accountant, when one looks at a tax treaty, it is important that one also sees what is the impact of the MLI. So it is very important that don't just read the tax treaty as is. See what is the impact of the MLI. See firstly if MLI is modifying the tax treaty, and if so, if there is any impact of the MLI on that tax treaty. Obviously you have the synthesized text, etc., which is also there on the income tax side, which is helpful in getting the sort of to understand what are the changes. But it is also advisable to visit the OECD website and see the key positions that have been taken by the other party to that double tax treaty, to make sure that there is no, because again synthesized text is prepared, but it's not it does not have any legal standing. So if there is any issue with the synthesized text, it may not hold good. So one would need to look at what is the actual change that is there on the basis of the position that is adopted by each party to a contracting jurisdiction. Again, section 195, I think it is very, very important, and I think Siddharth will also be stressing on that one looks at adequate documentation now. So earlier, one would look at just a TRC, Form 10F, and possibly a no PE declaration and get away with taking the benefit of the tax treaty, etc. But today I think that will no longer hold good. You would need to go above and beyond that. You would need to look into the transaction. You will need to ask for suitable declarations, documents, etc., to safeguard yourself, especially because the fact that any wrong information provided in the certificate can also trigger a penalty for a chartered accountant. On that note, I would like to thank all of you for a patient hearing, and also once again would like to thank the Borivali CP Studies Circle for giving me an opportunity to address the members. Thank you.
Thank you, CA Mahesh Bhai. Very good session indeed. Being an international tax student, it was intriguing to be listening to you all the time. We were all the time glued up. Well, as you said, it is a very vast topic to be learnt into, but I think you have taken us very well. You have introduced us to the pool. Now in the second session on 26th, I think we will take a dive also with CA Siddharth Banwat. Now, we thank you members for the patient hearing. I would request CA Aman Khandelwal to give a very well-deserved vote of thanks to our today's speaker.
Yeah. Thank you, Pradeep sir, for giving me the opportunity to give a vote of thanks. And as a student of international taxation myself too, and being read about the subject before, I guess it was a very detailed uh, seminar that was given by you, covering all the basic aspects of MLI. So I believe all the participants today who were new to this topic have got a very decent and a good sense, good knowledge about the topic after hearing to you. And thank you once again for giving the lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. With this, we end the session today. Thank you once again, CM Mahesh, for taking us through. Thank you very much, everyone. Our next meeting will be on, I think, 25th September. Most likely, it will be a physical meeting and it will be informed to the members via email. Thank you. With this, we end today's session. Thank you.